And our section you won't find in the notes. Most of the theories that revolve around what Jesus did, his work, his gaining for us salvation, tend to focus on the cross. And so we often, in Doctrine, don't think about the resurrection. And yet, a moment's thought, if Jesus had died on the cross and not risen, why would anybody have noticed? Why would anybody think that this was something more than just the death of a good man? No. Jesus' life, death, resurrection and ascension are all part of his work in bringing us salvation. And so the resurrection. We're going to take a moment to discuss together why we believe that the resurrection happened. I suggest you pause this video and then come back to it after that discussion. At the centre of our faith is the resurrection. That it happened is something we receive through history and through our own experience. But why does it matter? Well, firstly, it's a confirmation of who Jesus is. Paul in Romans 1, 3 and 4 says it's because Jesus rose from the dead that we know he is in fact God. Another thing about the resurrection is it confirms what Jesus' death achieved. I said earlier, without the resurrection, it would just be the death of a martyr. What led people to think that he was victorious was not just his death, but the triumph over death, which is the resurrection. Thirdly, the resurrection confirms that what Jesus said is actually true. Do you remember in John, he says, "Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And they laughed because they thought he meant the physical temple. He was referring to the temple of his body, and after he'd risen from the dead, his disciples reflected on that and knew that the words he had were indeed the words of the living God. Fourthly, the resurrection is a confirmation of the power of God. So we hear in Acts 2:32 and Romans 4:24, the power of God raising Jesus from the dead. And that's why we know, not just from God's creation, but from that mighty act in history, that God is stronger than death. Fifthly, the resurrection is something that needed to happen before the coming of the Holy Spirit. Again, John's Gospel makes this clear. It's the risen Jesus who breathes on his disciples and says, "Receive Spirit Holy, receive the holy breath." Until this point, the Holy Spirit was always talked about in the future by John, or linked to Jesus himself by the other Gospelers. Luke in Acts also links the Holy Spirit to Jesus. After Jesus' resurrection and ascension, his followers received the Holy Spirit. Paul agrees, so in Romans 8:11 we hear the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of Christ. That Spirit that is the power of God to raise him from the dead is the Spirit that he sends on his church. And that leads to the sixth reason. The resurrection is clearly the impetus, together with Pentecost, the coming of the Spirit, for the start of the church. No resurrection, no church. And finally, the resurrection is the confirmation of not just Jesus' individual victory over death, but his victory over death on behalf of us all. The resurrection shows us that death is not the end. He is the pioneer who's gone through death and come through to the other side. And so his resurrection is seen in the New Testament, particularly in 1 Corinthians 15, as the precursor of ours. Then you could say, well, what is this resurrection? Different people have thought about this over the years. Mostly until about the 17th and 18th century, Christians just took it as a bodily event, full stop. But with the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries and a greater emphasis on science and things you could test and prove, some people started becoming sceptical about anything that looked miraculous in the Bible. This is the age of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And this led to some stupendously sceptical views of the resurrection. They didn't want to dismiss its power. They could see that God was having an effect in history, but they were doubtful that anything called a resurrection actually happened. And so we get people like Gotthold Lessing, who wrote, "That then is the ugly great ditch which I cannot cross. However often and however earnestly I have tried to make this leap. If anyone can help me to cross it, I implore them to do so. And so I repeat what I said earlier. I do not for one moment deny that Christ performed miracles, but since the truth of these miracles has completely ceased to be demonstrable by miracles happening now, since they are more than reports of miracles, I deny that they can and should bind me to the very least faith in the other teachings of Jesus." That's quoted in McGrath in 2007, his Introduction to Theology. Basically, Lessing is saying, we don't see people raised from the dead now, so why should we believe it happened then? And even if it did happen then, what difference would that make to us now? For someone like Lessing, his rational autonomy is supreme. He won't accept anything he cannot see for himself. And so people like him dismiss the resurrection altogether as a reality. I'm not expecting you to agree with them, but it's worth knowing about them. Others suggested it was a myth. They didn't want to deny the importance of Christianity, but still rejected the possibility of miracles. So we get people like David Frederick Strauss, who was died in 1874, who in his Life of Jesus, published in 1835, attempted to explain the origin of faith in the resurrection of Jesus without any corresponding miraculous fact. For him, it wasn't that the resurrection was objective, but it was a subjective conception in the mind. To the people who followed him, it was as if Jesus had come back to them. As they remembered him, it inspired them. So, as a myth, it's not objectively true, but there is a deep truth to it. Most Christians don't go with that idea either. Some carried on with that idea further and thought of the resurrection as a spiritual experience of the disciples. So you get people like Rudolf Bultmann, who died in 1976. He also thought that miracles were impossible today. And while belief in objective resurrection may be reasonable in the first century, it wasn't to be taken seriously by a scientifically literate generation. So he said it's impossible to use electric light and radio equipment, and when ill to claim the assistance of modern medical and clinical discoveries, and at the same time believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. So for him, the resurrection is not physical but spiritual. Jesus is raised, not as flesh and blood, but in the preaching of the disciples. He's very much focused on the kerygma, the summary of the gospel that we see repeated in Acts, which is the spiritual essence of Christianity. As people hear this summary, this kerygma, they're moved spiritually and spiritually meet with Jesus. The real Easter faith is the faith in the word of preaching, which brings illumination. Now, there is truth in that. We do meet with Jesus. Is that enough? David Jenkins, who was born in 1925, hit the headlines as a theologian who was chosen to be the Bishop of Durham. He provoked controversy by arguing that the resurrection is not just a conjuring trick with bones. For him, the focus of the resurrection is Jesus' spirit being in his followers. For Jenkins, the true resurrection body of Jesus is the church and his spirit within it. So for him, the physical resurrection just wasn't important. He could take it or leave it. It was the spiritual resurrection. I don't think he ever did deny the physical resurrection as such, but he certainly downplayed it. And for many of us, that isn't enough. One reaction to this scepticism about the physical resurrection of Jesus came with Karl Barth, who died in 1968. He saw the resurrection as historical, but just beyond our critical inquiry. He moved from thinking the empty tomb as of little significance to seeing it as the indispensable sign of Jesus' historical objective resurrection. But it's an event that you can't get back to historically. As McGrath says of Barth emphasises that Paul and the other disciples are not calling for the acceptance of a well-attested historical report, but for a declaration of faith. The key is that the faith is a response to the risen Christ met today. The empty tomb is an important sign, but only a sign. For Barth, if it were empty for another reason, such as the body being stolen, it wouldn't be the end of his faith. But then there are those of us who believe that the resurrection is historical and is open to our critical inquiry. So we get theologians such as Wolfhart Pannenberg, who was born in 1928, who says history is important in Christian faith. Jesus came into the real world at a real point in time. So God's revelation is a universal, historical even, one which we can know about. And it is an act of God. For Pannenberg, the fact that Jesus' resurrection was a one-off in history was not disturbing as it was for those Enlightenment thinkers, because he argued they restricted their analogies, so their understanding, when they insisted that past events have to have something contemporary that's like them. But that's just not how history works. History has something that happened then, which doesn't necessarily happen now, because it happened then. To presuppose that the dead do not rise ever because we haven't personally experienced a resurrection, and so dismiss Jesus' resurrection, is actually to let our suppositions, and indeed our presuppositions, control our conclusions. We say it can't happen, so it didn't happen. But Pannenberg says, look at the historical evidence and evaluate it without such a bias. That means Jesus' resurrection is a breaking into history of something that we ourselves will experience, but not until the end of time. The problem with rejecting the physical resurrection is when we look from too short a viewpoint. At the end of time, it will be normal. Now it's too early to see it as that, but it's still something that happened. And now we come to the Ascension, which sadly is missed out in nearly all the Doctrine books I know, but yet is vital to the rounded understanding of what happened in Jesus. If you look at Mark 16, Luke 24, Acts 1, Ephesians 4, we all hear of the Ascension. The first three is an account. The last, in Ephesians 4, 7-13, connect it to the giving of the Holy Spirit. We also have in John 6:62 and in John 20:17, John talking about the Ascension. What's it about? Well, the first thing it does is it removes Jesus' body. If the church is to be worldwide, you actually need the body to be something that can be worldwide. While Jesus was physically present in one human body on earth, that's where everybody would want to be, but we couldn't all be there at the same time. It would favour a particular group of people. But by Jesus' body being removed and his spirit coming into the body of the church, all places could be where Jesus was here to save us, not just one place. Next thing is that the Ascension is about the exaltation of Jesus. In the Ascension, Jesus is seen to be glorified. We've spoken of as seated at the right hand of God. There are echoes of Daniel 7 here in the idea that one like a son of man comes on the clouds of heaven and is given all authority. Philippians 2. God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. For the Eastern Church, there's an emphasis on human nature now being taken up into heaven. So humanity continues to be united with the divinity through Jesus. And that is the sign, the sure and certain guarantee that our humanity can be united with the divinity. The Ascension's a preparation of the coming of the Holy Spirit. If you love me, says Jesus in John, you will obey my commandment, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. And in the Ascension, the focus shifts from Jesus to the Church's mission in the world. As the Spirit comes on the Church, we are the body of Jesus in the world. There's his human body in the heavenly realms and his church body on earth. And we have the privilege of being part of that.